Beloved family in Christ, before we begin, I want you to do something for me. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from as we pray together. Be honest, what would you do if you watched a 12-year-old boy standing beneath a gallows, heard the crowd crying for his death? Now here is the testimony. My name is Ibrahim Karim, and I was 71 years old when the incident happened. At that time, I lived in a large cream-colored house at 14 Al Madinah Road, near the old Eastern market of a city called Dar Salaam. I owned several textile shops, 2 warehouses, farmland outside the city, and a large house where my children and grandchildren often gathered. People in my city knew me as a successful man. But there was something I did not understand then. A man can have a full bank account and still have an empty heart. He can have a beautiful house and still be afraid when the lights go out. He can be respected by thousands of people and still be running from questions that follow him into his bedroom at night. I had those questions, but I buried them beneath business meetings, family celebrations, expensive clothes, and the confidence that comes from being called a respected elder. Then came the morning that changed everything. I remember the smell first: wet earth, smoke from charcoal fires, dust rising beneath hundreds of feet. It had rained during the night, and the road leading toward the old courthouse was muddy. I was sitting in the back of my black Mercedes when my driver, Bashir, suddenly slowed down. Through the windshield I could see people gathered far ahead. There were hundreds of them, perhaps more. Some stood on walls, others climbed trees to see over the crowd. Police officers had formed a line around the courthouse yard, and beyond them stood a wooden structure that looked darker than everything around it. I knew immediately what it was: a gallows. My stomach tightened. I had heard about the boy the previous evening. His name was Daniel Musa. He was only 12 years old. The story spreading through the city was that he had been accused of helping a group of thieves during a robbery that had ended with the death of a wealthy shopkeeper. People said the boy had been caught near the scene. Others said he had been protecting someone. Some claimed he had confessed. Nobody seemed to know the complete truth, but the crowd had already decided what they believed. As our car stopped, I looked through the window and saw him. He was smaller than I expected. His wrists were tied and his clothes were dirty. His face looked tired but strangely calm. There was a bruise near his left cheek, and his sandals were covered with mud. 2 officers were walking beside him while the crowd shouted. I heard angry voices demanding justice. I heard people calling him a criminal. I heard women crying. I heard someone behind me say that children who committed serious crimes should not be spared. Then the boy lifted his head. For one brief moment, his eyes met mine. I will never forget that look. It was not the look of someone who believed he was going to survive. It was the look of someone who had already surrendered his fear to someone I did not yet know. I stepped out of my car. Bashir grabbed my arm and warned me not to go closer, but I pulled myself free. I had no idea why I was walking toward that crowd. I had no connection to Daniel. I did not know his family. I did not know whether he was innocent or guilty. I only knew that something inside me was telling me to keep watching. When I reached the front, I noticed an older Christian woman standing behind the police barrier. She was crying so hard that her entire body was shaking. She kept pressing a small Bible against her chest. I asked her who the boy was, and through her tears she told me that Daniel was her grandson. She said he had been raised in a Christian home and had been arrested after trying to help a wounded man near the robbery scene. I looked back at Daniel. The officer placed him beneath the wooden beam. The crowd became louder. My heart began beating so hard that I could feel it in my neck, and then something happened that I still struggle to explain. The boy closed his eyes. He did not fight. He did not scream. He simply stood there as though he was looking at someone none of us could see. Then the wind stopped. The shouting seemed to fade. Even the birds disappeared from the trees. Daniel opened his eyes and looked toward the empty space in front of him. His face changed. His fear disappeared. And although I could not hear what he was saying, I saw his lips move as if he were speaking to someone standing directly in front of him. Then the rope was placed around his neck. Someone pulled the lever. The crowd screamed. I closed my eyes, but when I opened them again, Daniel was gone. The rope was swinging. The gallows was empty. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then someone shouted that the boy had fallen behind the platform. The officers began searching. People pushed against one another. The old grandmother collapsed to the ground. And I stood there frozen, staring at the empty space where a 12-year-old boy had been only moments earlier. But what frightened me most was not that the boy had disappeared. It was what I saw standing behind the gallows, a figure, a man dressed in white. And although I had never believed such a thing could happen, something inside me whispered that the person I was seeing was Jesus. I did not understand it. I did not want to understand it. But that was only the beginning. Because what happened next would force me, an elderly Muslim man who thought he knew exactly what he believed, to follow a trail that would eventually lead me to a decision I never imagined making. And the boy was not the only person who was about to disappear. For several seconds after Daniel disappeared, nobody seemed to understand what had happened. I remember looking at the rope swinging slowly in the wind, while the officers shouted at one another and pushed people away from the wooden platform. One officer crawled beneath the gallows, another ran behind the courthouse, and a third began searching the nearby trees, as though a 12-year-old boy could somehow have climbed one of them in the few seconds after the lever was pulled. The crowd that had been screaming for Daniel's death was suddenly silent. I could hear people whispering that perhaps the rope had broken, but I knew that was not what happened. I had been standing close enough to see everything. The boy had been there, the rope had been around his neck, the lever had been pulled, then he was simply not there. I turned toward the old woman who had called herself his grandmother, but she was still on the ground, trembling and holding her Bible against her chest. Two women helped her sit against the courthouse wall, and I moved toward her because I wanted answers. She looked at me with tears covering her face and asked whether I had seen him. I told her I had. She grabbed my sleeve with surprising strength and asked me to tell her exactly what I saw. I hesitated because I knew how foolish it would sound, especially coming from a Muslim man known throughout the city for being practical and careful. I told her that before Daniel disappeared, he had been looking at something in front of him. Her expression changed immediately. She asked me what I meant, and I told her that the boy had looked peaceful, almost as though someone had come to stand beside him. The woman began crying again and whispered that Daniel had told her something similar the previous night. She said that when she visited him in the holding room, he had told her that he was no longer afraid because Jesus had shown him that he would never be alone. At that moment, I felt uncomfortable. I had heard Christians speak about Jesus many times, but I had always considered such stories part of their faith, not something that belonged in my world. I told myself there had to be another explanation. Maybe the boy had escaped, maybe someone inside the courthouse had helped him, maybe the officers had made a terrible mistake. I was already trying to build a logical explanation in my mind when a young police officer suddenly came running from behind the building shouting that they had found something. I followed him despite Bashir begging me to stay back. Behind the courthouse was a narrow passage between two old stone walls leading toward a dry drainage channel. The ground was covered with wet leaves, broken bricks, and muddy footprints. Several officers were standing around a small wooden door that appeared to lead into an abandoned storage building. One of them pointed toward the mud and said they had found Daniel's footprints. We all looked down. There were small footprints leading away from the gallows, but what made the situation strange was that they began several meters away from the platform. There were no footprints immediately beneath the gallows. It was as if the boy had suddenly appeared on the other side of the yard and then started walking. One officer opened the wooden door and the smell of dust and damp wood came rushing out. Inside were old tables, broken chairs, sacks, and piles of forgotten courthouse records. We searched every corner, nothing. Then one officer shouted from the back. I walked toward him and saw a small opening in the wall. The boy's blue shirt was caught on a sharp piece of metal sticking from the bricks. The officer pulled it free and held it up. There was blood on the cloth. The grandmother arrived a few minutes later and immediately recognized it. She began crying so loudly that even the officers became uncomfortable. I remember touching the fabric with my fingers, and something about it disturbed me deeply. If Daniel had escaped through the building, where was he? If someone had carried him away, why were there no larger footprints? If the boy had somehow survived the gallows, why had nobody seen him leave? My mind was racing when I noticed something else. On the dusty floor beside the wall was a faint mark shaped almost like a cross. I stared at it for several seconds. I did not know whether it had been scratched into the dust by a person, left there by a piece of wood, or made by something else entirely. But when I looked at it, I suddenly remembered the figure I had seen behind the gallows. The memory returned so clearly that my hands became cold. I could still see the white clothing. I could still remember the strange calmness that had filled the boy's face. I quickly stepped away because I did not want anyone to notice how frightened I was. But then the grandmother approached me and said something that would trouble me for many nights afterward. She told me that Daniel had once described a man in white appearing to him during prayer, and she said the boy believed that man was Jesus. I wanted to reject her words immediately, but before I could answer, we heard a sound coming from the other side of the wall. It was a child's voice. Everyone froze. The officers drew their weapons and began moving toward the sound. I could hear someone breathing heavily behind the wall. The grandmother called Daniel's name, and the voice answered from somewhere nearby. I will never forget the expression on her face because hope and terror appeared in her eyes at the same time. We searched the passage again and finally discovered a narrow opening beneath a broken section of the wall. An officer knelt down and looked through it. Then he suddenly pulled his head back as though he had seen something shocking. He looked at the others and said there was a child on the other side. My heart nearly stopped. The grandmother pushed forward, crying that it was her grandson, but the officer held her back until they could make the opening wider. Within minutes, the bricks were being removed one by one. When there was enough space, I crouched down and looked through. There he was. Daniel was sitting alone in a dark room, his clothes dirty and his face wet with tears. He was alive. The grandmother screamed his name and tried to crawl through the opening. Daniel looked directly at her, but instead of immediately running into her arms, he looked past everyone and stared toward the empty corner of the room. His eyes were fixed on something I could not see. Then he slowly raised his hand toward that corner, and the entire room became silent. I looked where he was pointing, but there was nothing there except an old wooden chair. Daniel's lips began moving. He was not speaking loudly, but I could see that he was telling us that someone had brought him there. When the officer asked who had done it, Daniel looked at me. His eyes met mine through the opening, and he said that the man who rescued him wanted the old Muslim man to know that his life was about to change. I felt as though the ground beneath me had disappeared. I had never spoken to this child before that morning. I had never told him my name. Yet somehow he had singled me out from everyone standing there. I wanted to ask him what he meant, but before I could, Daniel pointed toward the empty chair again and began to cry. He told us that the man had shown him something before disappearing, and that what he had seen concerned me. I did not know then that the next thing Daniel would reveal would force me to confront a secret fear I had carried since I was a young man. I could not understand why Daniel was looking at me as though he had been waiting for me to arrive. The officers finally broke enough of the wall for the grandmother to enter, and she rushed toward him, pulling him into her arms and crying so hard that she could barely speak. Daniel held her tightly, but his eyes kept returning to me. I stood several steps away, confused and uncomfortable, because I had never met this child before that morning. One of the officers asked Daniel how he had escaped from the gallows, and Daniel shook his head. He explained that after the rope was placed around his neck, he had closed his eyes because he believed he was about to die. Then he said he felt someone standing beside him. He could not explain how, but the presence gave him peace. He remembered seeing a bright light and a man dressed in white. Daniel did not describe the man in a dramatic way. He simply said that when he looked at him, every bit of fear disappeared. He believed the man was Jesus. Daniel said the next thing he remembered was opening his eyes inside the abandoned room. He had no idea how he got there. He had not walked there and nobody had carried him. He said he simply found himself sitting on the floor, alive and breathing. The officers looked at one another because none of them had an answer. One officer accused Daniel of hiding the truth, but the boy insisted that he did not know how it happened. Then Daniel turned toward me again. He said the man had made him understand that I would come searching for an answer. I felt a strange pressure in my chest. I wanted to leave immediately, but my pride would not allow me to show fear in front of the officers and the crowd. I told myself that Daniel was only a frightened child whose mind had been affected by the experience, but then he mentioned something that nobody there knew. He said the man had shown him an old photograph of a young boy standing beside a river. I felt my face become cold because I knew exactly what photograph he meant. I had one like that hidden inside a locked wooden box in my bedroom, and nobody except me had seen it for more than 40 years. I left the courthouse before sunset, but I did not feel like the same man who had arrived there that morning. Bashir drove slowly because I was unusually quiet. Normally, I spent every journey discussing business, checking phone messages, or asking about the shops. That evening, I sat in the back seat staring through the window at the streets passing by. I kept seeing the same images in my mind: Daniel beneath the gallows, the rope swinging, the empty platform, the figure in white, and the child's eyes when he mentioned the photograph. When I reached my house at 14 Almadna Road, my eldest son, Kareem, came outside to greet me. He immediately noticed something was wrong and asked whether I had been injured. I told him I was fine. I did not tell him what I had seen. I walked into my study and locked the door. The room was filled with things I had collected over many years: business documents, old watches, family photographs, awards, and books. I went directly to the large wooden cabinet in the corner. My hands were shaking as I opened the bottom drawer and removed a small metal box. Inside was the photograph Daniel had described. It showed me when I was 17 years old, standing beside my younger brother Yusuf near a river outside our hometown. Yusuf had been 12 years old at the time. He was smiling at the camera, wearing a white shirt and holding a small wooden cross that belonged to a Christian friend of ours. That photograph carried a painful memory because Yusuf disappeared only a few months after it was taken. My family spent years searching for him, but we never found him. I had buried that pain so deeply that I rarely allowed myself to think about it. I had always told people that Yusuf was probably dead, but privately I had never been certain. Now a 12-year-old boy I had never met had somehow described the photograph and told me that the man in white had shown it to him. I sat in my chair and stared at the picture until my eyes filled with tears. For the first time in decades, I whispered my brother's name aloud. Then I heard a knock at the door. It was my wife, Amina. She asked why I had locked myself inside. I quickly put the photograph away and told her I was tired. She looked at me for several seconds and said she had never seen me look so frightened. I wanted to tell her everything, but something stopped me. I was afraid that if I said the words aloud, they would become real. That night I could not sleep. Around 2 in the morning, I left my bedroom and walked into the courtyard. The moon was hidden behind clouds and the house was silent. I sat beneath the old mango tree and tried to pray as I had done throughout my life, but my mind would not settle. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Daniel standing beneath the gallows. Then I remembered the figure in white. I asked myself why a Christian image had appeared to me when I had spent my entire life rejecting the idea that Jesus was more than a prophet. I felt angry with myself for even thinking about it. I told myself that fear was making me confused. I reminded myself of my wealth, my family, my position, and everything I had accomplished. But none of those things could answer the question that had followed me home. How did Daniel know about Yusuf's photograph? Suddenly, I heard a soft sound behind me. I turned quickly, expecting to see one of the servants. Nobody was there. Then I noticed that the door to my study was slightly open. I was certain I had locked it. I walked inside and found the metal box sitting on my desk. I knew I had placed it back in the drawer. I opened the box, and beneath the photograph was a small piece of paper I had never seen before. My hands began trembling as I unfolded it. There was only one sentence written on it, but I did not understand who had written it or when it had been placed there. I stood beneath the dim light, reading those words again and again, while a memory from my childhood slowly returned. It was a memory I had spent more than 50 years trying to forget, and suddenly I realized that the strange event at the gallows had not begun that morning. It had begun when I was 17 years old, beside a river, on the day my brother disappeared. The next morning I woke before the first call to prayer, but I did not feel rested. I had spent most of the night sitting in my study, staring at that photograph and the strange piece of paper I had found beneath it. I had read the sentence so many times that I knew every letter, yet I still could not explain how it had appeared there. I decided to return to the place where Yusuf had disappeared, because something inside me told me that the answer was connected to that day. I told Amina that I needed to travel outside the city for business, and before sunrise I left with Bashir. The journey took almost 3 hours. As the city disappeared behind us, the roads became narrower and the houses fewer. I remembered being 17 again, walking beside Yusuf along the river with wet grass touching our ankles. We had gone there because Yusuf wanted to meet a boy named Samuel, the Christian son of a fisherman who lived nearby. My family had forbidden me from spending time with Christians, but Yusuf had been curious about everything. He asked questions that sometimes made my father angry. On that particular afternoon, we sat beneath a large tree while Samuel told us about Jesus. I remember laughing at him. I remember telling him that our family already knew the truth and that he should stop trying to change our minds. Yusuf did not laugh, he listened carefully. Then he asked Samuel why Christians believed Jesus could forgive sins. I remember feeling embarrassed by the question, so I walked toward the river and left them talking. That decision had haunted me for decades. When I returned several minutes later, Yusuf was gone. Samuel was lying unconscious near the tree, and there were footprints leading toward the water. We searched until darkness came, but we never found Yusuf. My father blamed Samuel. The police questioned everyone. Some people said Yusuf had drowned, others said he had been kidnapped. Eventually the case was forgotten, but I never forgot the last words Yusuf said to me that afternoon. He had asked me why I was afraid to listen. At 17, I thought he was talking about Samuel. 50 years later, sitting in the back seat of my car, I wondered whether he had been talking about something much deeper. When we arrived at the river, I stepped out of the car and immediately felt a strange heaviness. The place had changed, but not completely. The old tree was still there, although its branches were larger and twisted with age. I walked toward it slowly, touching the rough bark with my hand. Bashir stayed several meters behind me. I could not explain why I had brought him, but I did not want to be alone. I stood beneath the tree and remembered Yusuf's face. For the first time in decades, I allowed myself to cry. I told myself that I was an old man who had spent his life pretending that nothing could hurt him. I had lost people, made mistakes, and watched friends die, but I had always pushed forward. Yet standing beside that river, I realized that my wealth had never healed the wound left by Yusuf's disappearance. I suddenly heard footsteps behind me. I turned and saw an elderly fisherman approaching. He was carrying a net over his shoulder and walking with a wooden stick. He studied my face for several seconds before asking whether I was Ibrahim Karim. I was shocked because I had not told him my name. I asked how he knew me, and he said his father had once worked along that river. Then he asked whether I had come because of Yusuf. My heart began racing. I asked him what he knew. He told me that his father had kept a secret for many years because he was afraid of my family. On the day Yusuf disappeared, his father had seen the boy alive after we thought he was gone. According to the old man's story, Yusuf had been taken to a small Christian house several kilometers from the river because he had been injured. He stayed there for several days before leaving with someone who promised to take him safely to relatives in another town. The fisherman did not know what happened afterward. But before I could ask another question, he reached into an old leather bag and removed a folded piece of cloth. My entire body became weak when I saw it. It was white fabric with a small blue thread sewn along the edge. The fisherman said his father had found it near the river and kept it because he believed it belonged to Yusuf. I touched the cloth with trembling fingers. I recognized it immediately. It was from the white shirt Yusuf had worn that day. I asked why nobody had told my family. The fisherman lowered his eyes and said his father had been threatened by someone who warned him never to speak about the boy again. I felt anger rising inside me, but beneath the anger was something even stronger, fear. If Yusuf had survived that day, then where had he gone? Why had nobody told us? And why, after 50 years, had a 12-year-old boy at a gallows somehow become connected to that forgotten story? Before I could leave, the fisherman reached into his bag again and pulled out a small Bible wrapped in plastic. He told me that Yusuf had left it behind. I stared at the book without touching it. He said his father had found it beside the river on the same day Yusuf disappeared. I asked whether there was anything written inside. The fisherman opened the cover and showed me a name written in faded ink. It was Yusuf's handwriting. Beneath his name was a date from more than 50 years earlier, followed by a short note that made my chest tighten. The note said that if anything ever happened to him, he wanted his brother Ibrahim to know that he had finally found the answer he was searching for. I could barely breathe. I asked what answer he meant, but the fisherman shook his head and said he did not know. Then he pointed toward the road and told me something that made me forget everything else. He said a Christian family had lived in the area during that time, and one of their children had been named Daniel. I immediately thought of the boy from the gallows, the same name, 12 years old. A Christian family, a strange connection stretching across 50 years. I asked whether it could possibly be the same Daniel, but the fisherman said he did not know. I returned to my car carrying the old Bible, the piece of cloth, and more questions than I had arrived with. On the journey home, I could not stop thinking about what was happening. I had gone to the river expecting to find evidence about my missing brother, but instead I had found a path leading directly back to the boy whose disappearance had shaken the entire city. And deep inside me, a terrifying thought was beginning to grow. Perhaps Daniel had not been brought into my life by accident. Perhaps the God I had spent my whole life refusing to seek had been patiently following my story long before I ever knew his name. When I returned home that evening, I carried the old Bible into my study and placed it on the desk without opening it again. For several minutes I simply stared at it, because touching that book felt like touching a part of my brother that had been buried for half a century. I called my driver Bashir and asked him not to tell anyone about my journey. Then I locked the study door and sat alone. Eventually, I opened the Bible. The pages were yellow, some were damaged by water, and several had handwritten marks in the margins. Yusuf had written his name inside the cover, followed by the date of the day he disappeared. As I turned the pages, I found small notes beside passages about forgiveness, fear, mercy, and faith. I could not understand why my brother had been so interested in these things. Then I found a folded piece of paper near the middle of the book. It contained a list of names. At the top was Yusuf's name. Beneath it were the names of several people I did not recognize, followed by one name that made my hands freeze. Daniel Musa. I read it again. Daniel Musa. The same name as the 12-year-old boy from the Gallows. I immediately told myself it had to be another Daniel, because the Daniel I had seen was only 12 years old. But beneath his name was another note saying that the family connected to him had been praying for someone named Ibrahim for many years. I pushed the Bible away from me. I was becoming frightened by how many impossible connections were appearing. I remembered Daniel's words about the man in white and the photograph of Yusuf. I remembered the figure I had seen beside the gallows. I remembered the strange sentence on the paper in my metal box. Everything seemed to be pointing towards something I did not want to face. I closed my eyes and asked myself a question I had never seriously asked in my 71 years. What if Jesus really was who these people believed he was? The thought disturbed me so much that I stood up and walked around the room. I told myself I was allowing emotion to control my mind. I had been shocked by Daniel's disappearance, and now I was connecting unrelated events. Yet when I opened the Bible again, my eyes fell on a passage about Jesus seeking the lost. I did not know why, but I began to cry. The following morning, I went back to the courthouse because I needed to see Daniel. The area was quieter than the previous day, but people were still talking about the impossible event. Some said the officers had secretly released him. Others claimed the entire thing was a trick. A few people had already started calling it a miracle. I found the grandmother sitting outside a small office, and when she saw me, she stood immediately. She asked whether I had discovered anything. I told her about Yusuf, the old Bible, and the name Daniel written inside. Her face became serious. She told me that Daniel's parents had always taught him to pray for people he did not know. She said that months earlier, Daniel had begun praying for an elderly Muslim man whose name he did not know. According to her, he had repeatedly told the family that he believed God was preparing someone to discover the truth about Jesus. I asked how a child could know such a thing, and she said she did not know. Then she told me that Daniel had been having dreams for several weeks before his arrest. In those dreams, he saw an old man standing beside a river, holding a photograph of a young boy. The grandmother said Daniel had never met me and had never seen Yusuf's photograph, yet the details were almost identical. I felt my knees become weak. I sat down and asked her to bring Daniel to me. A few minutes later, the boy entered the room. He looked tired, but there was a peacefulness about him that I could not explain. I asked him whether he knew anything about Yusuf. He nodded slowly. Then he told me that before the gallows, he had seen the same river from his dreams. He said he saw a young man standing beside the water and an older man standing behind him. When he described the older man, I realized he was describing me as I looked today. I asked him what the young man had been doing. Daniel said the young man was holding a small Bible. My eyes filled with tears. I asked Daniel whether he knew the young man's name. He said the name was Yusuf. I could barely speak. I asked him how he knew that name. Daniel looked at me and explained that the man in white had shown him the young man and had made him understand that the story was not finished. Then Daniel said something that frightened me more than anything else. He told me that Jesus had shown him that my greatest battle was not against another religion, another person, or another belief. My greatest battle was against the fear of surrendering my life to God. I left the courthouse that afternoon with Daniel's words following me like a shadow. I drove home and went straight to my bedroom, where I opened the metal box again. This time, I removed the photograph of Yusuf and placed it beside the Bible. I looked at the smiling face of my younger brother and remembered the way I had treated him when we were teenagers. I remembered mocking his questions about Jesus. I remembered telling him that people who followed another faith could never understand us. I remembered walking away from him beside the river because I was too proud to listen. For 50 years, I had blamed everyone else for his disappearance, but now I wondered whether my own pride had been part of the reason I never searched deeply enough for the truth. That night, I sat alone in my study and opened the Bible again. I began reading slowly, even though I struggled to understand some of the words. I reached the account of Jesus meeting people who were afraid, broken, rejected, and lost. I expected to feel anger, but instead I felt something I had not experienced in years: peace. Then sometime after midnight, I heard footsteps in the hallway. I looked toward the door and saw my grandson standing there. He told me he had been awakened by a strange sound coming from my study. I asked what sound he had heard. He said it sounded like someone crying. I told him nobody was crying, but when he pointed toward the desk, I noticed something that made my heart stop. The old Bible was open, even though I remembered closing it. Beside it was Yusuf's photograph. Across the photograph was a thin line of moisture, almost like a tear had fallen onto the face of my younger brother. I reached for the picture, and beneath it I discovered another handwritten message hidden inside the Bible's cover. This time I recognized the handwriting immediately. It was Yusuf's. The message was written decades earlier, but it contained my name. And when I read what he had written, I realized that the answer to my brother's disappearance was much closer to my own family than I had ever imagined. The handwriting on the page looked exactly like Yusuf's, although the ink had faded with age. My hands trembled as I held the Bible closer to the lamp. The message was not long, but every sentence seemed to strike something inside me that I had kept buried for decades. Yusuf had written that he knew our family would never understand why he wanted to follow Jesus, so he had decided to leave a message for me in case he never returned. He wrote about being afraid, not of death, but of living his entire life without knowing God personally. He wrote that a Christian family had helped him after the river incident and that they had treated him with kindness when he was injured. He said they had never forced him to believe anything, but they had shown him a different kind of love. He also wrote that an elderly Christian man named Samuel had told him that forgiveness was not weakness, and that Jesus had a way of finding people who believed they were too far away. I stopped reading for several seconds because the name Samuel immediately reminded me of the Christian fisherman I had met as a teenager. I had not remembered that detail for 50 years. Then I continued. Yusuf wrote that he wanted me to know that he had not forgotten me. He said that if I ever found the Bible, I should not be afraid to open it. He wanted me to understand that God was not calling me because I was rich, respected, or important, but because I was lost. Those words broke something inside me. I looked around my beautiful study, at the expensive furniture, the framed awards, the polished shelves, and the safe where I kept documents worth more money than my father had ever seen in his entire life. Suddenly, none of it seemed impressive. I was an old man sitting alone with a Bible that belonged to my missing brother. And for the first time, I understood that wealth could buy comfort, but could not answer the deepest questions of the human heart. I began crying uncontrollably. I pressed my hands against my face and whispered Yusuf's name. Then I asked God to show me the truth, even though I was terrified of what that truth might cost me. The next day, I asked Daniel's grandmother to bring him to my house with his parents. I knew it was unusual, but I wanted the boy to see the Bible and photograph. When they arrived, my family was surprised to see them. My eldest son, Kareem, asked why a Christian family was visiting, and I told him I needed to discuss something important. We sat in the large living room, and I placed the Bible on the table. Daniel immediately recognized it. He touched the cover gently and told me he had seen it before in his dreams. I asked him what he knew about Yusuf. He explained that his grandmother had told him stories about a young man who had once stayed with their family many years ago, but she had never told him the man's full story. I looked at the grandmother, and she finally admitted that her parents had sheltered Yusuf after he was injured. She said Yusuf had stayed with them for several weeks and had become very close to the family. He had asked many questions about Jesus, prayed with them, and eventually decided that he wanted to follow Christ, but then someone from my family had come searching for him. The grandmother's father had become frightened and secretly helped Yusuf leave the area. She did not know where he went after that. I asked why they had never contacted my family. She said they believed they were protecting him because powerful people had threatened them. I felt anger rising, but it quickly turned into sorrow. For years, I had believed Yusuf had been abandoned or killed. Now I was hearing that he may have survived and spent part of his life trying to find a path toward God. Then Daniel suddenly looked toward the doorway. His expression changed. He became quiet and seemed to be listening to something none of us could hear. I asked him what was wrong. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he told me that he could see the man in white again. I looked at the doorway and saw nothing. Daniel then turned toward me and said that the man was showing him another place. He described an old railway station outside the city, a place I had not visited since I was a young man. He said he could see a bench beneath a broken sign and a man sitting there with a Bible in his hands. I felt a strange fear because I remembered something from my past. Years earlier, I had heard a rumor that Yusuf had been seen near that station. I had dismissed it because nobody could prove it. Now, after 50 years, Daniel was describing the exact place. That evening, I drove to the old railway station alone. I did not tell my family where I was going because I was afraid they would stop me. The station had been abandoned for years. Weeds covered the tracks, the old ticket office was falling apart, and broken glass lay across the ground. I walked slowly toward the platform Daniel had described. There was indeed an old bench beneath a damaged sign. I sat down and looked across the empty tracks. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine Yusuf sitting there decades earlier, waiting for someone who never came. I began to pray, but I did not know exactly how to pray. I simply asked God to forgive me for my pride and to lead me toward truth. A few minutes later, I heard a vehicle approaching. An elderly man stepped out and looked at me from across the platform. He stood still for several seconds before walking closer. When he reached me, he stared at my face and asked whether I was Ibrahim Karim. I said yes. He took a deep breath and told me that his father had once worked at the station. Then he opened an old leather folder and removed a photograph. My heart stopped when I saw it. It was Yusuf. He was older, perhaps in his 20s, standing beside a Christian family. On the back of the photograph was a date and a short message. I turned it over with shaking hands. The message said that Yusuf had not died at the river. He had lived. He had traveled far away. And before he left, he had asked someone to find me someday and tell me one thing. The old man looked directly into my eyes and said that his father had been searching for me for more than 40 years. Then he handed me another envelope. I opened it slowly. Inside was a letter from Yusuf that began with my name. But I could not finish reading it there, because the first sentence revealed something that changed the entire story of what happened at the Gallows. I sat on that broken railway bench with the envelope trembling between my fingers, while the elderly man who had brought it stood a few steps away and gave me time to read. The letter began with my name, and the first words immediately brought tears to my eyes, because Yusuf wrote that he had never hated me for walking away from him beside the river. He said he had spent many years praying that I would one day understand why he had been searching for something deeper than money, family honor, or religion. He explained that after leaving the river, he had traveled with the Christian family that helped him and eventually settled in another town. He had become a teacher, married, raised children, and spent his life helping poor families. He never forgot our family, but he was afraid to return because he believed his return would bring trouble to the people who had protected him. Then came the part that shook me most. Yusuf wrote that he had learned to trust Jesus because he believed Jesus had found him when he was frightened and alone. And he wanted me to know that following Christ had not made him hate his family or his former faith. Instead, it had taught him to forgive. He wrote that he had prayed for me every year, even when he did not know whether I was alive. He had asked God to protect me and soften my heart. Then he mentioned something that connected directly to Daniel. Yusuf wrote that the Christian family who helped him had a grandson who was born many years later, and that the family had continued telling stories about the young Muslim boy who had once stayed with them. That grandson was Daniel's father. I lowered the letter and stared into the distance. Suddenly, the entire story seemed to form a circle. Yusuf had been connected to Daniel's family decades before Daniel was born. Daniel had somehow become connected to me through the mysterious events at the gallows. And I had spent my entire life believing that Yusuf's story ended at the river, when it had actually continued far beyond anything I knew. I asked the elderly man whether Yusuf was still alive. He looked down and quietly told me that Yusuf had died several years earlier. I felt something inside me break. I had spent 50 years hoping that one day my brother would walk through my door, and now I knew that day would never come. Yet his letter had somehow reached me at the exact moment I was beginning to search for God. I returned home carrying the letter, and when I entered my house, I found my family waiting in the living room. My wife could immediately see that something had happened. I sat down and told them everything. I told them about the railway station, the photograph, the letter, and the truth about Yusuf. Karim listened without interrupting, but when I finished, he asked the question I had been avoiding. He asked whether I now believed that Jesus had something to do with all of this. I looked at my son and realized that I could no longer hide behind uncertainty. I told him that I did not have every answer, but I knew that something had changed inside me. I had spent 71 years believing that I could control my life, yet one 12-year-old boy, one missing brother, one old Bible, and one unexplained event had brought me to my knees. That night I asked Daniel's grandmother if she would allow me to attend a Christian service. She agreed, but she warned me that becoming a Christian was not about chasing miracles or mysterious experiences. She said it was about knowing Jesus, trusting him, turning away from sin, and learning to live according to God's word. Her words stayed with me because they sounded different from the emotional excitement I had been feeling. She was not trying to impress me. She was telling me that faith would require a real change in my life. The following Sunday, I entered a small church near the market. I had attended many religious gatherings throughout my life, but walking into that church felt different. People did not know who I was. Nobody cared about my money. Nobody stood up because I was wealthy. An elderly woman offered me a seat beside her, and a young man handed me a Bible. I sat quietly while people worshipped. I expected to feel embarrassed, but instead I felt strangely peaceful. Then the pastor began speaking about the lost being found, the broken being restored, and people who had spent years running from God finally surrendering their hearts. Every sentence seemed to touch the exact place I had tried to hide. I lowered my head, and tears began falling onto my hands. I realized that I was not crying because I had seen a miracle. I was crying because I finally understood that I had spent my entire life trying to become important to people while ignoring the one who gave me life. After the service, I remained seated while everyone else slowly left. The pastor approached me and asked whether I wanted prayer. I told him that I did. He did not ask me to repeat a dramatic speech. He simply prayed that God would guide me, forgive me, and give me the courage to follow the truth wherever it led. As he prayed, I remembered the gallows. I remembered Daniel standing beneath the rope. I remembered the figure in white. I remembered Yusuf's letter. Then something inside me became completely quiet. I realized that I had been looking for an explanation to a miracle, when perhaps the greater miracle was what had happened inside my heart. I had gone to the courthouse as a proud Muslim businessman who believed he had answers. I had left as an old man filled with questions. Now, sitting inside that little church, I understood that the questions were not destroying me. They were leading me somewhere. I opened the Bible the young man had given me and looked down at the first page. My hands shook as I whispered that I wanted to know Jesus for myself. I did not make that decision because Daniel disappeared from the gallows. I did not make it because of the strange figure I believed I had seen. I made it because after decades of running, I finally understood that my heart was hungry for something my wealth could never provide. But just when I thought my journey had begun, the pastor received an urgent phone call. His face changed as he listened. When he ended the call, he looked directly at me and said that Daniel was missing again. This time there was no gallows, no crowd, and no police announcement. The boy had disappeared from his family's home during the night, and before leaving, he had placed something on my doorstep. When I heard what it was, I immediately knew that whatever had happened at the gallows was not finished. I rushed out of the church with the pastor and drove toward Daniel's neighborhood while my mind raced through every possibility. I kept asking myself why this child had become connected to my life so suddenly. When we reached his family's small house, the street was filled with worried neighbors. His grandmother was standing at the doorway, crying, while Daniel's parents searched every room. I asked when they had last seen him, and his mother explained that Daniel had gone to bed normally. Sometime during the night, she heard him walking through the hallway. When she checked his room, he was gone. The window was still locked from inside, the front door had not been opened, and nobody had seen him leave. Then she pointed toward my house, and my heart began pounding. Earlier that morning, someone had found a small object on my doorstep. It was the old photograph of Yusuf. I had left that photograph inside my study the previous evening, yet somehow it had appeared outside my house. On the back was a sentence written in handwriting I did not recognize. I read it several times, trying to understand what it meant. The message suggested that Daniel had gone somewhere willingly and that I should not search for him out of fear. I immediately rejected the idea of leaving the boy alone. He was 12 years old. Whatever strange things had happened before, I could not simply assume that a child was safe. The police were called and we searched nearby streets, empty buildings, the market, and the road leading toward the old railway station. I kept thinking about the figure I had seen at the gallows, but I also forced myself to remember that Daniel was a child who needed protection. As evening came, we still had no answer. I returned to my house exhausted and sat in the same study where I had first opened Yusuf's Bible. I placed the photograph on the desk and prayed for the first time in my life with complete honesty. I admitted that I was afraid. I admitted that I did not understand what was happening. I asked God to protect Daniel and show me what I needed to do. Then I noticed something I had not seen earlier. Beneath the photograph was a small piece of paper with an address written on it. The address belonged to an abandoned chapel on the far side of the city, a place I had never visited. I showed the address to the pastor, and he immediately recognized the location. He said the chapel had once been used by a group of missionaries many years earlier, but had been abandoned after a storm damaged the roof. He also told me that Yusuf had visited that chapel during the final years of his life. That information sent a chill through me. We drove there with 2 police officers and Daniel's father. The road was rough, and by the time we arrived, darkness had covered the area. The chapel stood behind a line of tall trees. Its walls were cracked, and part of the roof had collapsed. We entered carefully, using flashlights to look through the empty rooms. At first there was nothing. Then we heard a faint sound coming from the back. It was someone praying. We moved slowly toward the sound and found Daniel sitting on the floor near an old wooden cross. He looked tired but peaceful. His hands were folded and his eyes were closed. His father rushed toward him and pulled him into his arms. Everyone began crying. I stood at the doorway, unable to move. Daniel looked at me and smiled. I asked him why he had come there. He explained that he had felt strongly that he needed to pray for me and that he had not been afraid. I told him that disappearing without telling anyone was dangerous, and he apologized. Then he reached beside him and picked up an old notebook. He said he had found it beneath a loose floorboard. When he handed it to me, I recognized the handwriting immediately. It was Yusuf's. My hands began shaking. The notebook contained several pages of prayers and thoughts from the final years of his life. He had written about me repeatedly. He wrote that he believed one day I would encounter Jesus, but he did not know when or how. He wrote that he wanted me to understand that God had not forgotten me. Then, near the final page, he had written about a boy who would one day stand in a place of death and become part of my journey toward Christ. I looked at Daniel in disbelief. He had been 12 years old when the gallows incident occurred, exactly as Yusuf's old writing seemed to describe. I asked Daniel whether he knew anything about the notebook. He shook his head. He said he had only found it beneath the floor. We returned home just before midnight, but I could not sleep. I sat with Yusuf's notebook in front of me and began reading every page. One entry described a dream Yusuf had experienced many years earlier. He had seen an old man standing beside a river while a child stood nearby. In the dream, the child was holding a small light, and behind him stood a man in white. Yusuf had written that he believed the dream meant someone from our family would eventually discover Jesus through an unexpected event involving a child. I closed the notebook and stared at the ceiling. I had spent my whole life believing that God had forgotten me, yet my brother had been praying for me long before I ever knew I needed prayer. Then I remembered something Daniel had said at the chapel. He told me that the man in white had not appeared to him because Daniel was special. He believed the purpose was to make me understand that God could use ordinary people and strange circumstances to reach a heart that had become hard. That statement stayed with me. I realized I had been focused on the supernatural parts of the story because they were easier to discuss than the condition of my own heart. I had seen a boy disappear from a gallows, but the deeper miracle was that an old man who had trusted money, reputation, and pride for 71 years was finally beginning to surrender. I knelt beside my chair and prayed again. This time I did not ask for another sign. I simply asked God to forgive me and teach me how to live. The following morning I woke with a strange peace, but it did not last long. At breakfast, my son Kareem entered the room holding a newspaper. His face was serious. He told me that the authorities had reopened the old case surrounding the gallows because new evidence had been discovered. Someone had found the original court records, and according to those records, Daniel had never been legally sentenced to death at all. The entire execution had been based on a forged document. I stared at my son, unable to speak. Then he showed me the final page of the newspaper. There was a photograph of the old courthouse. I held the newspaper so tightly that my fingers began to hurt. The photograph was grainy and poorly lit, but there was no mistaking the shape standing behind the gallows. A man in white appeared several steps behind Daniel, his face turned slightly toward the boy. The strange part was that nobody in the crowd had reported seeing him. The journalist who took the picture said he had been standing on the courthouse roof and had photographed the entire scene just before the execution began. When he examined the photograph later, he noticed the figure. He returned to the courthouse and asked several people whether they had seen anyone dressed that way, but everyone said no. The police believed it was probably another person standing behind the platform, distorted by the poor quality of the camera. But when the photograph was enlarged, the figure appeared clearer rather than less clear. I stared at the image for several minutes, remembering what I had seen with my own eyes. I wanted to believe there was a simple explanation, but something inside me told me that I was looking at the same figure I had seen that morning. Then I noticed something else. Daniel was looking directly toward the figure. His eyes were not closed. He was watching someone. The pastor took the newspaper from my hands and studied the photograph carefully. He reminded me that faith was not built on photographs or strange events, but on knowing God through His Word. His warning helped me because I realized I could easily become obsessed with miracles instead of focusing on Jesus. I asked him whether he believed the figure was Jesus. He said he could not prove what the photograph showed, and neither could I, but he reminded me that the important question was what the event had produced in my heart. Had I become kinder? Had I forgiven people? Had I begun seeking God? Had I stopped trusting money and reputation? Those questions were harder than any miracle. I realized that I had been searching for evidence outside myself when God was already showing me evidence through the change taking place inside me. That afternoon, I returned to the courthouse with Daniel, his parents, the pastor, and several officers. The place looked different in daylight. The gallows had been removed, and investigators were examining the ground around the platform. One officer showed us the original court documents. Daniel's name had been added to a list of accused people, but his supposed conviction was based on a document that had been signed by someone who had never been authorized to issue such a sentence. The officer said someone had deliberately created the false record to make the boy appear guilty. The more they investigated, the more confusing the case became. Daniel had been innocent from the beginning. Someone had wanted him blamed for the robbery, and the people who had demanded his death had never known the truth. I watched Daniel standing quietly beside his grandmother, and I felt ashamed. The crowd had judged him without knowing his story. I had also judged him when I first saw him. I had assumed he was another troubled child caught in a terrible situation. Now I understood that I had been watching something much larger than a mystery. I had been watching a child remain calm while adults allowed anger and fear to control them. Daniel looked at me and reminded me of something he had said before. He believed Jesus had rescued him so that people would stop and listen. I asked him what he thought I should do now. He said I should forgive the people who had lied about him and help his family recover. That answer struck me because I had spent my life believing that strength meant having enough power to defeat your enemies. Daniel was teaching me that forgiveness could require greater strength than revenge. I decided to use my resources to help his family, not because I wanted praise, but because I finally understood that God had blessed me with wealth that I had spent too much time using for myself. Several weeks passed, and my life began changing in ways my family noticed immediately. I started attending church regularly. I read the Bible every morning before opening my business reports. I spent more time with my grandchildren. I visited people I had ignored for years and apologized to men I had treated badly because I thought my money made me more important than them. Some relatives became angry when they learned that I had begun following Jesus. One cousin told me I had disgraced the family. Another said I had been manipulated by Christians. I did not fight them. I told them that I still loved them and that my decision was personal. I prayed for them instead of arguing with them. The more I studied the life of Jesus, the more I understood that becoming his follower was not about becoming proud of being right. It was about becoming humble, forgiving others, loving people, caring for the poor, telling the truth, and trusting God even when life was difficult. One evening, months after the incident, Daniel visited my home. We sat beneath the same mango tree where I had once cried over Yusuf. I told him that his courage had changed my life. He smiled and said he did not believe it was his courage that had changed me. He believed God had simply used his situation to open a door I had kept locked for 71 years. I looked toward the sky and remembered the figure behind the gallows. I still cannot explain everything I saw that day. I cannot prove every supernatural detail, and I do not claim to understand why God allowed such a frightening event to happen, but I know what happened inside me afterward. A proud old man began to pray. A man who trusted wealth began to trust God.